Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Talks program. As you know, the festival is about the convergence of art and technology. This program station begins. I first thank a few of our sponsors. The Talks program, which is Talent House. This is their office, and so they basically clear out of their office every day for Thursday and Friday and let us take over, which is really nice. And then also HP Labs and the Media Center for helping with a live stream, which is available in 2D and 3D after the festival. And then I'd also like to thank Somini Sengupta for moderating this panel, and I think she can take it from here.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Thanks for turning up on a Sunday morning. I've seen this film. I hope you have or will very soon. And so I want to introduce the director, Brian Knappenberger. He spent many years as an independent documentarian. He made 2 frontline documentaries before starting on this project, among other things. And one of them was about the killing of a Ukrainian journalist, very much along the same themes of freedom of speech, free expression in Ukraine. And he's brought this lens now to looking at what I think is one of the most fascinating movements in our times, and it's all the more fascinating because it's global in scale. Yeah. Next to him is Ryan Singel, editor of Threat Level. Ryan's been looking at these issues for 10 years at Wired, and writing principally about security and privacy, looking at the anons for at least the last 5 years or so. So I hope that there's a great conversation and that you guys have lots of questions and we can have some time for that. So I wanted to just ask you, what drew you to this subject first? Why anonymous?
Should I hold it?
Should I do this?
Can you guys hear me without this? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, actually, that's nicer not to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I was drawn to making a film about Anonymous. In fact, they first came on my radar when in 2008 they attacked the Church of Scientology. They did raids against the Church of Scientology, and I live in LA, and Scientology has a pretty big presence in LA. And so these raids were fairly significant. And they were kind of a bizarre thing to watch. It was kind of a weird scene, because here you have a church created by a science fiction author, being protested by people wearing masks created by a science fiction author, right? This was weird, and I think that up until that point, the internet hadn't really called people into the streets in the kinds of numbers we saw with those raids. These were something like 142 cities all over the world, over 10,000 people had showed up.
What year was this, Brian?
This is 2008.
And did you make a mental note to yourself at that point?
I did, yeah. I did. I thought about I instantly wanted to know more about what this weird scene was, and so I started thinking about a film. But then I kind of shelved it for a while, and got involved in other projects. We have lots of other documentary series and things like that, and it kind of roared back to life for me in December 2010 when they attacked MasterCard, Visa, and PayPal. They did distributed denial of service attacks against those companies, when those companies all in one day cut off financial services to WikiLeaks. And suddenly, Anonymous roared into action and tried to shut their websites down in a kind of protest of spectacle, really. And I immediately thought this is changing, and things are happening in really interesting and dramatic ways, and I'm going to start kind of following the action.
And so that was the moment when you thought this can be a film.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I would think it's pretty hard to make a film about guys who are behind a computer.
Extraordinarily difficult. Yeah. I mean, some of my other work for PBS or whatever has been, often I find myself following scenes, in verite style, looking for people doing things in action. Well, most of the action here takes place in this kind of online landscape. So it was very much a challenge to try, how do you visualize that? How do you bring this world into life in the kind of playfulness and explosive kind of creativity that to do it justice?
Tell, and this is for both of you, I think there's, I would love to hear your take on what exercises Anonymous. What are they about? What do they want? Not just their means, but the ends.
You want to start?
Sure.
This is a tough one, actually.
Yeah, this is a very tough one.
This offers no end to observation.
No, it's true. I think one of the things that you kind of learned most, and I learned a lot of this, I have a great writer who works for me who's covered this, Quinn Norton. She's in the film. For about the last year, she's been, we sort of said, embedded with Anonymous. And she wrote a series of articles in December called titled Anonymous 101. So if you want to read them, they're fantastic.
Excellent. One of the better
Kind of definitive pieces.
Yeah.
And what she describes very well is that Anonymous, she's trying to come to grips and understand what it is that Anonymous is actually a culture. Anonymous is sort of constantly like creating its own culture. They create their own music, they create their own memes. And it's a young culture, so it's very new. So when I started following Anonymous, Anonymous was a very different culture. We used to be very, very hard on Anonymous because they were purely pranksters. And in some ways, sometimes, often hilariously funny. Some of the things you'll see in the film, they used to go into Habbo Hotel, which was a sort of like a second life for teenagers, for kids, and you get these little avatars and you get to wander around and talk to people. And they would go in these raids, and 100, 200 Anons would go in. They'd all dress in the same little avatars in the same little costume. They'd choose a black guy with an afro and a black suit, and then they would just mess with people in the game just for fun. They would block the pool, and then they would, and then if they got asked why, they would say the pool's closed because of AIDS, right? And this is like a children's game, right? And it's awful, but it's also funny as hell. But they would do some awful things. So we were actually, we sort of made fun of them a lot early on, using, and I think unfairly so, some of the stereotypes. Kids who, 24-year-olds who are still living in their parents' basement, that sort of thing.
And this was an apolitical Anonymous, would you say?
Yeah, it was very apolitical.
Yeah.
This all came out of, there was a board called 4chan as a website. You can stick images up there, have conversations, but you almost never use your real name. And there was a board there where sort of anything could go called the B board. And so it kind of came out of there. And there were sort of awful things and great things. So if you've ever been rickrolled, somebody sending you a link to that Rick Astley song, which now we've actually seen, I think some congressperson actually
I think it was part of the 2008 presidential election.
Yeah.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
Barack Obama's campaign used that as a joke.
Yeah, and it's like, wow, it's like straight out of like the horrible days of Anonymous, right? It's sort of like this culture that sort of like spews these things out.
So how did we get from, so now it went from the prankster to a much more political Anonymous.
Yeah.
But what kind of politics? Are there certain issues that consistently exercise the movement?
Yeah, I think you still see like a kind of a continuous stream, and you're seeing, and you get to the point that there's lots of contentions along the way, and and the culture has changed. Early on, I think the first political moment was when they took on this guy, Hal Turner.
Yeah.
This is also in the film, who was a neo-Nazi who had a online podcast and was fairly well known, was like outspoken, and they, Anonymous decided to pick a fight with him, or he decided to pick a fight with Anonymous, depending on who you talk to. And then it sort of elevated, and then like it got to the point that they're like, we have a cause. This neo-Nazi, he's awful, right? And so it stopped being about
Like, wow, we can be a force for good.
right, yeah. And so
Not
it
just
changed.
chaos and weirdness.
Right. So then, that was sort of like, okay. And then, there's certain things. So like, Anons want to be able to say whatever they want to say. They believe in internet freedom. They want to be able to go where they want to go. Things like, the Great Firewall of China, things like copyright restrictions really bother them online. I think those two sort of, at least those two things, sort of like internet free speech. I would say that one thing is the one thing that kind of keeps going, and then after that, it gets hard, right?
Yeah.
Everyone in Anonymous agrees with that.
Yeah.
Even though there's kind of arguments on, there's some arguments on what that means, of course, but after that, yeah, it gets hard.
It's one of the immense. You write about these issues for the New York Times too. So that some of the kind of complexities of getting your head around what Anonymous is as a reporter. It's tough because it always changes. I was reminded recently of this writer that described compared history to physics. Right, that physics, if you get back and you see a kind of landscape, it's mountains and trees and air and wind and gravity, and all kind of makes sense. But if you get close, it's all mold spores and weird viruses and strange cells, and any intuitive sense of how it works kind of gets thrown out the window. Anonymous is a little like that. Like if you follow it day by day, the Twitter feeds, the kind of discussions, it's kind of ugly and crude and weird and bizarre. But if you kind of step back and sort of say, well, which is sort of the effort of the film, where are they going? Where are they coming from? What do they want? You can kind of gain a bigger picture of that.
And I think, what's your best approximation of what they want?
Well, I think that my analysis is, everybody kind of has their take on where they're going and heading. I mean, they do rise up most forcefully with freedom of speech issues, no doubt. Things that they perceive as restricting their freedom of speech. So that's kind of central, So issues like SOPA are
right.
made for them.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, and they find out about that stuff before anybody else does.
Yeah.
I mean, I was following that very closely. Anonymous was beating those drums before anybody started.
And so there are a couple of things, it seems to me, that have given Anonymous something to rally around. WikiLeaks
that's true.
was one. Occupy was another.
Yeah.
Now, how did that happen? Do you think there were arguments within the collective about whether we should rally around this issue and then that issue? Were there any flashpoints that you saw within the movement?
As it sort of pivoted to Occupy,
Yes.
basically?
Yeah.
Well, there was, as people in the Bay Area know, the big operation BART.
Right.
So it seemed to me that was very intense at the beginning when the sort of the BART police had cut off.
What did they do for those who may not know?
Protests about two people that were killed, that had been killed. There were protests in the BART system, and during one of those protests, the infrastructure they turned off the communications, which is deeply offensive to Anons. This is something that really became a flashpoint, and that sparked a whole round of protests that happened week by week. I was watching. I think it was maybe by the 4th or 5th or 6th week. You felt it kind of waning a little bit, and then Occupy came in with this kind of just this tsunami almost.
Right.
And they kind of moved to that.
So it
Although
was
there
really
still
this
are
freedom of expression issue,
Yeah.
like cutting off communication that got Anonymous
That's the
into this,
flashpoint.
right?
Yeah.
But then they embraced Occupy and the whole language of
Yeah.
Occupy and gave it a kind of new fillip, you know?
There were some debates inside Anonymous about Occupy. There are certain things that are very very closely tied to Anonymous, like just being able to go to the streets and demand to be heard, to create your own media, to create your own sort of there was all sorts of interesting projects about trying to create your own like secure communications infrastructures inside the camps. So those things are very straight anonymous issues, but then you start getting into like problems of, you start talking economics and economic changes, and then you've got, anons are across the spectrum. You've got the radical anarchists, you've got the libertarians, you've got, the progressive Democrats, you might even have some like, maybe old style conservative, Republicans. So it's just a little hard once you get into those kinds of issues. So I think.
Did they argue about whether to join Occupy?
I wasn't in on them, but Quinn, that was one of the things that Quinn was watching, and there were people that felt like that wasn't something that they felt should happen. But the thing about Anonymous too, though, is that there are ops. So these sort of each thing sort of gets broken into its own little section.
Right.
An operation.
An operation, right? So it's sort of the funny little names. So it's very possible you can disagree with an op, you can argue with them over it. But the other thing you can do is just not join in.
Just not do it. Yeah.
Right. So they're the people that really disagreed with it. They might argue that this isn't something that an op that Anonymous should be doing. But then they're free to go over and do some work to try and help dissidents in Syria or decide to take on a Mexican drug cartel, which may or may not actually have happened.
Which may or may not have happened. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying?
Just a brief thing on your kind of bigger picture, Anon. Ryan makes a great point in the film that actually I had thought a lot about he compares it. He says Anonymous is almost the opposite of Facebook, right? Facebook is you are your real person, right? That's the whole point of Facebook. And I think, we've done little documentaries on Facebook and is Mark Zuckerberg. I think Mark Zuckerberg thinks you're the same person in all walks of life. You're the same person at work, at play, at a party, in bed, and that should be perfectly transparent to the world. Anonymous is the exact opposite of that. They make the case for anonymity. They make the case for that they don't want to have all of their personal and private information kind of extracted, and yet they still want to participate in the grand kind of largeness and creativity of the web. And it's not just protected speech from dictators and oppressive regimes that might be trying to silence you. That's a part of it, but it's also kind of corporate extracting of your personal data. I mean, like a Facebook business model is essentially sell your personal data for pennies.
Why is anonymity important today?
Well, one of the first thing I would say about that is that there I think Anonymous would believe that there's a reasonable expectation that you can communicate in private and not be surveilled, and the internet offers a huge, as great as it is, there's a dark side to it too, and that is the fact that all of our lives can be tracked, all of our communications can be tracked, and that creates real problems for political dissidents, that creates real problems for people, but not just that, it creates problems for maybe a basic sense of, do we want that to be the case?
Do you think anonymity has emerged as a kind of political ideology?
I think it has, but it hasn't been, well, I want to hear you. I'd love to hear what you. I don't know that it's been explicitly said that way.
Yeah.
But I do think that connects a lot of the dots with Anonymous.
That is something that they're fighting for.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the Moot. You use portions of his TED talk.
Right.
So Moot is this young kid who started the 4chan board. He started when he was 15 or 16. His parents didn't even know he did it, and it became this huge sort of like underground sort of thing, right? So you could go there and you could talk about all sorts of different things. And he gives this TED talk is really worth watching. He's a very spirited defense of anonymous speech online. There's lots of things that anonymous speech online can do that is really useful. So I mean, say you're having, you're having body issues and you're anorexic, right? And you want to go, do you really want to have that conversation on your Facebook wall? And you want to talk with other people that are doing the same things, or if you're a teenager and you're not sure if you're gay or you're straight, right? There's places for anonymity. There's even place for anonymous political speech, right? Being able to speak up about something that is terrible going on in your community, and you live in a small community. How do you talk about the corruption of your police office, the police officer when the guy lives right next door to you, right?
Yeah.
So that and it's harder. It gets harder and harder. It's very easy to be tracked online. And the tools that you need to be able to actually speak online anonymously without it being tracked back to you aren't the easiest things in the world to use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've seen people that think they're anonymous. Who end up
Seems
not being
sophisticated.
anonymous. Yeah, it seems sophisticated.
Yeah.
Oh, and it gets tracked back to them. And there's the, of course, the bigger cases when you're, a whistleblower against, like, the
That's what I was
NSA,
gonna-
or if
that's
you're
what I was
like,
gonna say, yeah.
or if you're in Syria and you're trying to get out a film about, it's showing the, a street battle. Do you really want the Syrian government is all over that network, tracking everything.
So these are like really abstract issues,
Yes.
right? Anonymity, guys sitting behind a computer. How did you find the characters who were going to drive this film, and how difficult was it?
Well, it was difficult. I mean, I talked to a lot of people that had done a lot of thinking about Anonymous, Biella Coleman, who's in the film. And Ryan, I think we had talked on other projects and before. So I started a conversation of just, well, how, who are these people? And then I started just hanging out where they hang out and started talking to them.
The chat rooms.
The chat rooms,
Who
IRC
are the
chat.
most interesting people that you've met?
Well, that's
Talk
tough.
about a couple of them.
That's tough because, almost everybody in Anonymous is really interesting story. It's like you find these people that are really passionate about what they believe in. You may disagree with them, but they're often very compelling individuals. Getting them to come forward, of course, is slightly contrary to the culture, right? There's a grandstanding that is very much frowned upon in a group that praises a kind of collective mentality. So that was difficult, but some of those people that have come forward, they take heat for it, but they're respected and all of this stuff. So,
So Barrett Brown
Barrett
is
Brown
one of
is
the people
one. He's in the
who
film,
has
yeah.
Come forward. He's
Yeah.
kind of a self-described spokesman at times. Tell me about Barrett. Like, who is he? What's he like? What happened to him?
Barrett, I almost think he's like a Hunter S. Thompson, or like a. He's a really
Can you tell us
odd
a little bit
and
about who
compelling.
he is?
Yeah, Barrett Brown is. Well, he was a writer for a long time. He wrote for some articles for the Huffington Post and things like that, and led a kind of secret life for a long time as a member of Anonymous. And at one point he came forward. He sort of came forward and said, "I'm not in it anymore. Well, maybe I'm a spokesman. Well, not really. Not." So it became this very undefinable kind of title. But he clearly was involved, tuned in to the group. And very active, but he's
And what's his story? Like, what motivated him to do this?
What motivated Barrett?
Barrett,
What do you,
man.
maybe you can help me with Barrett. Barrett is an interesting, really captivating, interesting guy.
Yeah, he's in the film.
He's
I love-
currently, by the
yeah.
way, in jail.
Yes.
Yeah, he was picked up a couple of weeks
He was
ago.
picked up a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
While he was actually live chatting on the police busted in. He was actually chatting with people.
There was they do these sort of live chat video feeds, and you can see it online. He's arrested on visual. Or hear most of it.
So what do you think motivated Barrett?
Barrett's an interesting character. He's had some substance abuse issues in the
That's true.
past.
Yeah.
He's. I mean, no one doubts his honesty or sort of his passion for what it is. But
Yeah.
Barrett's also very much like a big giant figure about himself. So the same way that you can think of a Hunter S. Thompson, being all about his craft, but it's also about Hunter S. Thompson, right? And I still love the cut in the movie when he's making fun of furries, and then you do the cut to the big animal up on the wall. It's still my favorite part of the cut. So yes, he honestly.
And what happened to him? How did he?
How was he arrested?
Yes, tell the story of how he was recently arrested.
Oh. Do you know what? I mean, he was arrested. He was arrested for. There's probably all kinds of issues, but to be perfectly honest, but he was arrested for actively threatening an FBI agent on a YouTube rant that he posted about 2 weeks before he was arrested.
How do you make sense
as
of that?
Ryan said,
do you think he wanted to be arrested?
I think
do you
there's,
think he wanted to
as
get
Ryan said,
additional attention?
It's a video. The video he got arrested for is so hard to watch. It's 10, 15 minutes long. He's talking about sort of these, conspiracies and and things that sound right. So you're talking about Aaron Barr, and then you've got some other. There's I'm trying to remember the name of the company that's just got sort of outed by WikiLeaks for supposedly
Stratford?
Yeah, Stratford.
right.
Not Stratford. No, it was the
Trap code?
Trap. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's kind of stringing together all these conspiracies, and Anonymous is always about conspiracies and sort of
Yep.
like things that like look really like suspicious, and then and then, someone at the New York Times sort of looked into it and was like, yeah, I'm sorry, there's no there,
There's no there
right?
there, right.
But he kind of like, no, there's something there. There's tying all these pieces together. So he's got sort of this conspiratorial mindset. So he just sort of went overboard and like essentially like threatened a.
So that's
fairly
Barry.
violent,
You didn't
fairly
make,
violly threat. I mean, it's hard to watch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but
Yeah.
I believe you guys.
Yeah.
So Barrett didn't make a great effort to hide himself.
Not the contrary.
Topiary
Yeah.
did. Can you talk about who Topiary is and what makes him interesting? To those of us
yeah.
who may not know him?
There's a sort of splinter group from Anonymous last year that got a lot of attention and gained a lot of people. It really attracted a lot of interest, called LulzSec, Lulz Security. And this was essentially, Anonymous is a big collective. LulzSec was a small group of people, probably six or seven people total, and another kind of maybe smaller circle of people that contributed just outside that, but small. Topiary was one of the main kind of forces of that, along with Sabu, another guy named Sabu. And Topiary, the interesting thing about Topiary is that everybody within Anonymous kind of has their different skill set, right? Some people are really good at the political stuff. Some people are really good at the PR stuff.
What was Topiary good at?
Topiary was good at PR. Topiary clearly has a skill. I mean, I've sat down with him a few times and met him. He's a young kid, but he's a 19-year-old kid, maybe 20 now. With a very clear skill for humor and the kind of voice of the internet, and just kind of getting people laughing and riled up, and he has a real genuine skill for that.
And what motivated him to join the movement?
I think that he is not, in my opinion, after talking to him, he believes in the kind of political causes, but he seems more of the kind of jokester, let's have fun kind of element to it. He's not quite as gung-ho, need to change the world as some people are.
And how did he get caught? How did he get outed?
How did he get outed? Well, that's an interesting question. The other member that I mentioned, Sabu, as it turns out, was working for a large part of last year as an FBI informant. So this very kind of bombastic wing that kind of broke off of Anonymous, called LulzSec, about fairly closer to the beginning of their 50-day run, the FBI arrested Sabu, and within a 48-hour period turned him into an FBI informant. So from there, the majority of the really intense, bombastic activity that LulzSec did was under his direction. He was really the kind of leader, the kind of ringleader of it. So I think right now, Topiary and 3 other defendants right now are facing trial in England and the UK. They're piecing together how they got arrested, but I think the obvious thing is that Sabu had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, these are fascinating characters. Is there anything else you recall about Topiary or Sabu?
I think for me, what's really interesting about Topiary, I mean, now we know who he is as a young kid, but before it was just sort of this handle, was how amazingly original his writing was.
Really, yeah.
Really fantastic. Gripping, funny, sarcastic, and it was fast too. So LulzSec really, when they first started off, they were just going to do they kind of announced they were going to do 50 days, and this was the spring of 2011.
Yeah.
50 days of kind of crazy hacks, and they were going to go after everybody. And they occasionally put out these manifestos, and the manifesto, like the one when they ended after 50 days, is just an amazing piece of writing. Yeah. And I think what it speaks to is that Anonymous has this, it is creating its own culture, and they're not putting out these sort of cliches of like talking about Big Brother, or like 1984. Like those aren't, they don't rely on the same sort of cliche memes that I have to say that happens a lot in writing that kind of ends up in newspapers and media. So one thing it kind of points out is how much like anonymous really is generating this like interesting culture. So like, some of the videos and things you see sort of like are terrible, or you've got those anonymous, or we're here, and they got that sort of computerized voice, but it's very creative, and everyone's sort of out trying to outdo one another. So I think it's hard to it's easy not to to sort of like focus on the hacks themselves and not see this as like as also just very much like this culture generation sort of
the images, the memes that are coming out.
Right. So like part of what LulzSec was hacking into like crazy things, right? But then they also had this like spokesman that was like hilarious and funny. And so in some ways like they were a little different from Anonymous because they had sort of a different audience. Like the security community, in some ways loved LulzSec, right? Because LulzSec was going in and like busting into every web server they could sort of basically whichever one they decided to point at that day. And all the security guys have been working inside of companies like seeing their bosses are freaking out, like hoping like what if we're next? What do we do to not to be a target? And they're like, oh, give us money. So finally, like the security guys are like, we're actually going to get some funding.
Well, not only that, some people were sort of like, well, we've been telling you about these vulnerabilities for a while anyway. So now this bombastic kind of loud group comes along and it's splashed on the page.
They were also doing two kinds of attacks. One was to go in, to break into a company's systems and extract stuff out, extract data, people's names, email addresses, other kinds of personal information. And the other is what's called a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack, which is like literally lobbing junk data, at a system so that it slows down. It can't absorb it, slows down, or just kind of like breaks down. Those are two very different kinds of weapons, if you will. And there were some people who knew what they were doing when they were extracting data, when they were doing, I think, the much harder, more damaging hacks. And then there were a bunch of guys and women who you profile in the film who were doing the DDoS, who just sat at their computers and pushed a button again and again and again and again. And that slowed down, I think on occasion took down some websites.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk about that DDoS as a weapon? Did these guys know what they were doing? Did they know that this might have been criminal trespass in the same way that a civil disobedience protester would know that sitting down in the lobby of a hotel or a restaurant and refusing to leave is a violation of the law and is prepared to be arrested? Were these guys who were participating in the DDoS attacks, were they trained? Did they know what they were doing?
A lot of them weren't. Some were, some weren't. Didn't know what they were doing. I mean, I think that the interesting thing about DDoS is that a lot of people compare it to a sit-in, a physical sit-in. So just like in the 60s or in Occupy, you go out and you shut down a street. This is just
you get arrested.
And you get arrested for that, yeah.
And you spend time in jail. I mean, we know this from.
Yes.
Right.
That's absolutely true. So, there's a lopsided nature at the moment, assuming that you accept the idea that DDoS is a kind of virtual sit-in, and that there's a very lopsided kind of punishment right now that they're facing as compared to somebody who shuts down.
What do you think is lopsided?
Well, if you shut down a street corner in protest of a war, you might get a night in jail and a $250 fine. So the Anonymous 16 that we profile in the film are now facing potential punishments of 15 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
And they are accused of?
They are accused of slowing down or for a brief period stopping PayPal. When PayPal cut off financial services to WikiLeaks. This angered them. They sort of roared into action, and they shut down PayPal for a while. So that's and those people were caught largely because they didn't protect themselves. They were able to be tracked.
Right.
So the thing is, the folks that got nailed for that attack were not really the ones who were probably doing the most damage.
Right.
Because there's ways of doing a DDoS attack from your home computer, and you're kind of limited by how fast your connection is. Then you can also, if you're a little more sophisticated, you can have a botnet, where you
A network of robots.
network of
literally.
infected computers,
Dummy
computers,
computers.
around the world.
Your computer at night, basically.
And so the people that do that, they're not the ones who got arrested, right? And there were definitely bots involved in the attacks on Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. And so there was a, and it's not clear that kind of attack, is that really the same as a sit-in? I don't know. I mean, it's hard. If is it really fair if you wanted to shut down the Woolworths counter if you hired 1,000 zombies to do it with you? Like, I don't know that it's really the same thing as just putting yourself on the line.
It's an interesting,
Right.
it's a very interesting
comparison.
territory. Yeah.
Right.
I think, just one other point about DDoS is I don't think, denial of service, a lot of people look at it as that it should be a kind of protected First Amendment activity, right? This is political speech. And yet, I don't think it can be kind of uncritically embraced because it's very much a neutral tool. Anti-anonymous hacktivists. There's a notorious one called the Jester, right? Jester has used DDoS against WikiLeaks. So if it's freedom of speech on the one hand, is it freedom of speech for the Jester too?
Right, and if everyone was lobbying cannons on behalf of whatever they believed in, should that be allowed?
Right.
Especially against websites that other people use.
Sure. And I'm not sure the answer is, we don't know the answer yet, really, because I don't think the laws and the mechanisms are there
But this movement is testing
the
law.
I do think so.
The movement is
And I do
testing
think
the
that the Anon 16 that we follow in the film will be a test case for this.
We have like 10 minutes left.
we done already?
Yeah, we have like 8 minutes left. So could we open it up to some questions? Is there someone to pass around to get?
I guess you've already started to answer the question, but I've always been curious, to what extent is the anonymous movement a centralized, coordinated, top-down kind of thing, and how much is it just sort of distributed people doing independent actions? Sort of the way they try to meld the global terror network into one Al-Qaeda entity.
Yeah. I think at different times it has a different feel and different shape to it. The short answer is it's very much decentralized and very chaotic. But individuals at different times to get a kind of attention and gain some followers and I think you could say that they're leaders at various moments, but those people go away and other people do, and half the group will disavow them and think that what they're doing is idiotic. So it's a little bit of both.
And in particular ops and particular operations,
Yeah.
there's definitely directions being given by one person or another. And that's how, in the end, some of the Anons were arrested when Sabu turned to a federal informant and encouraged, very clearly encouraged in the chat rooms, other people to commit illegal acts.
Yeah.
No,
Pointing at targets,
Yeah,
teaching
no,
them how to use tools.
Yeah, this Sabu saga is going to be very interesting. A lot of that, especially with one of the biggest hacks was in December last year of Stratfor, which was a kind of a private intelligence company. You could sort of, they would try and, you were a big corporation, you wanted to know what the political situation was going to be in the Middle East or in certain countries, you could sign up for this sort of thing. So they broke in and they stole all these emails, and all this happened largely at the direction of Sabu, who had, at that point, been working for the FBI for 6 months. So it's going to, as the trial comes out, there's going to be lots of questions, and at this point, it seems almost beyond. Was it a setup? Is it beyond entrapment?
Yeah.
Is there some sort of ulterior motives to sort of make, to discredit Anonymous? Not just trying to, nail these 5 guys.
Right.
But
It'll be a very interesting case to follow.
it's going to be very weird when you've got an informant inside that was directing it for a long time.
Absolutely.
There's a question over here.
What appeals to me about it is that, the laws, there is no law. We're being infringed all the time. our data is being, government agencies are looking, everybody's looking at our data. There is no law. And this whole thing about the law, nobody's obeying the law. And I think that's what appeals to me about it. And it really, I don't know. And I think the public has been worked over. I think the United States does have groupthink. I think we are being worked on. And I like their way of thinking that is this spontaneous. You can't nail it because people's real thinking cannot be nailed. And I like the way that they're letting it rip in that way.
They do let it rip.
Yeah, good for them. And then when everybody decides to obey the laws, like the government and corporations, then they can go sit down and talk about how you're going to respect other human beings. But forget it. Keep on going.
Do you have a Guy Fawkes mask with you or something?
No, I don't even know. My brain doesn't work with a computer. No, I can't do it. So it's like, I have to talk to, tell them.
Yeah, I mean, you aren't a conspiracy theorist. Like we did have the warrantless wiretap program started by the Bush administration, and every lawsuit against it has been thrown out, either thanks to retroactive immunity given to the telecom companies, or on the theory of state secrets, that even a judge, a federal appointed judge, can't be trusted to actually know what happened, even though it's very clear that the law was broken. I mean, John Ashcroft actually, it's one of my favorite stories ever.
Yeah.
John Ashcroft was going to resign because what the government was doing was so awful. In fact, there's a great story. Scott Shane, I think it was his book. It was about, it was called U-Turn on Constitution Avenue is the name of the chapter, and it's a fantastic story of the sort of when John Ashcroft's in the hospital and he's threatening to resign over the warrantless wiretapping program. And so we don't get, the government gets to break the law and can't sort of face these things. So I think that, when you've got, and then what happened with PayPal and Visa and MasterCard all cutting and Amazon all cutting off services to WikiLeaks at the same time.
None of them. Request of Joseph Lieberman.
Yeah, Lieberman asked, and then maybe there was some of the State Department sent a memo to WikiLeaks, and then none of these companies would explain why they did it. WikiLeaks has never been convicted of a crime. Publishing classified documents in the United States is a long-standing tradition. The New York Times is particularly good at it, and then we don't get any answers, right? So as a journalist, I'm not saying we should take down PayPal, but I totally understand why that happened, right? Like I want to know why can't I donate to WikiLeaks if I want to?
Yeah. Most dramatic recent example of this is the whistleblower William Binney that came forward from the NSA, 32-year veteran of the NSA who worked on surveillance software, mostly for other countries, and he resigned in protest recently. When he realized that some of the software and tools that he was working on, they had actually turned on American citizens, very much outside of laws and constitutional laws. So he's come forward and sort of said, look, this is happening now, even though it's illegal. And there's these kind of odd loopholes that they've decided are okay, in that they think that at this point they can record all electronic communications, but they're not. They can get around getting a warrant to look at those things until you do something wrong in their eyes, and then they get a warrant. Then they can look back at this trove that they've done, this kind of history of stuff. So it's not infringing upon your rights until they actually look at this stuff that they've already recorded. That's the current loophole.
I mean, it's an interesting trade-off. The cloud, where all our data is stored, makes it really easy for us to keep our email forever and our music forever. It also makes it very easy for the government to find, your cell phone location data forever without spending the resources to have someone follow you around for 3 months.
One way I think sometimes of Anonymous is that they seem aware, any technology has a good side and it has a dark side. And Anonymous, to me, seems to be swimming in the dark side, right? They seem to be aware of that dark side, surveillance, the restrictions of freedom of speech. These are the things that anger them the most. they're almost like the canary in the coal mine that already smell the air going bad, and it's and they're kind of screaming from the rooftops in this kind of politics of spectacle. So you could agree with them, you can hate them, or not, you can love them, you can think that they're criminals.
But they're part of the zeitgeist.
But they're part of the zeitgeist, and they're bringing up issues that are arguably very important for us all to be talking about, and they're some of the first ones that really bringing it to the discussion.
There's a woman in the second row with the mic. Yes.
The question that I have is, do you feel like this is leading to more anarchy, or do you feel it's leading to more oppression?
More
oppression and
more
repression.
Repression, okay.
And
repression,
oppression.
right.
And when you say this, do you mean the anonymous movement, or?
Yes.
Okay.
One of the people in the film is a guy that, sort of security strategist, a guy that's done some good writing on Anonymous, a guy named Joshua Corman. His primary concern about Anonymous is that they do something that has a kind of backlash effect where the laws become even more draconian, and they end up tripping over themselves in a way and causing more draconian laws. I think that's a legitimate concern. And so I think he's got a point with that.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's hard to control your message. So when there were the attacks on Visa and MasterCard and PayPal, attack on Visa and MasterCard, that sounds awful, right? They attacked Visa.com and MasterCard.com. I doubt anyone in this room has actually ever visited those websites. Those websites have nothing to do with the payment system.
Or your money.
Or your money. Like nothing was going to go on. PayPal was a little different. They actually did go after the payment mechanism online. But that was, so it was supposed to be a very symbolic attack, right? Because if you want a Visa card, you're actually going to get it through Chase or Citibank or your local credit union, hopefully. But the press that came out, right? It was, Visa, MasterCard attacked, right? And those are the headlines, right? And so then it can, it leads to this sort of, then the government saying, oh, we need to pass these laws. The NSA says, anytime there's sort of an attack, there are forces that want to increase control over the internet. So these things can come back against you. So you hear stories of a DDoS attack, and then all of a sudden, Senator, Joe Lieberman's perfect at this, and then he's like, we need to pass this law where the government has a kill switch for the internet. And you're like, why would, because somebody could take down a website with a lot of traffic, does the president need to have a kill switch for the internet?
Yeah.
But it's hard. But I don't. And they work very hard to control their press and to do things, but you can't control the press, right? So. You can manipulate us, but you can't control us.
Good question.
The last person's question was on the same line I was aiming at, and brings to mind George Orwell's 1984 novel and movie, which foresaw a state of severe repression that was the culmination of years of social protest in Britain at the time. I'm just curious to know whether you foresee anything like that. I realize we're not there yet, and those who want to do something will always find a way around the system.
Well, you guys would probably do this. I can just briefly say, I think, any new advance in technology, and I think maybe the internet is maybe one of the greatest inventions of all time, maybe. I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think it's one of the great, certainly of my lifetime. So, any new technology has a dark side, like we said. It can also be maybe the greatest tool for surveillance ever created. So I think any advance forward, I think it's smart to look for what's the downside, what's the dark side, we've got the cloud, but what else does that bring that we might not want?
Yeah, okay, loop back a little bit. I'm going to try and combine the questions, are there going to be these sort of pushes back, right, or sort of blowback? In the 90s, we had a movement called the cypherpunks, and these were groups of hackers and engineers who were very concerned about freedom on the internet and trying to figure out tools for making that happen. So how can you create, encrypted emails? So there was lots of work around that. One guy, Phil Zimmerman, came up with this idea of what's called PGP, which is essentially a way that people can send encrypted emails to one another without someone on the outside being able to do this. And it was considered illegal to export. This kind of encryption. Encryption was subject to military control. But that was about selling, so he just put it online for free, and he thought he was going to go to jail. And so there was a whole movement in the 90s, and the government, Al Gore wanted to, and Bill Clinton wanted to make it so that all encryption had a backdoor for the government, and there was a whole movement, the sort of cyber, sort of encryption wars happened, and part of what came out of that movement was some of the groups that we all know very well now, with the Center for Democracy and Technology, Electronic Privacy Information Center, and probably best well known, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I think you're always going to have this sort of you have this movement that's like sort of radical, and they're always going to exist, and then from that you're going to get sort of more mainstream organizations that learn to organize and fight within the process, So that's what I'm hopeful is. Anonymous is going to add more, and I think it has. I think you saw a lot of people mobilized on the internet over SOPA and became very aware of kind of internet freedom. And we've seen a lot of little small groups that are starting up there. So I'm hoping that's what we'll see out of Anonymous is this amorphous group, its energy sort of creating more organizations that are worried about user rights and user freedoms and
Really great point.
Yeah, I mean, technology is always going to be a little bit faster than the law, but they're both in human hands, for better or worse. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Ryan and Brian.
Thank you for Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks again, guys. This has been wonderful. I won't break my back. Let's just give him one more round of applause. It's been wonderful. Thank you, guys. The next panel is at 1 p.m. It's hosted by Variety, and it's filming in Northern California. And the director from the new Steve Jobs film will be here, as well as I think the production designer and a couple others. So stick around. We'll see you in a bit.